Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of ANCAP Radio. I'm your host, Adam Carswell, the voice of liberty, and today we have an oldie but a goodie lined up for you. So if you are new to ANCAP Radio, you're with us here live or on the replay. First and foremost, make sure you hit that like button, hit that retweet button, go ahead and throw us a follow, and let's get into it. So this week we are streaming an archive, a golden archive. I was trying to find the right words for it. But for those of you who are not familiar with Jayant Bhandari, he's been featured on the show here several times before. He has a great conference that he does in Vancouver every year called Capitalism Morality. I know sometimes it's a bit puzzling to hear that there could be anything great tied to anarcho-capitalism in Canada, but believe it or not, there are some sweet spots here, I will say. So anyways, Jayant does a great conference every year. He just ran it only a couple weeks ago on June 1st. So anyways, this is a Doug Casey presentation from Jayant's conference in 2014, 10 years ago. And we wanted to bring this one to the light, one, because the title is just super compelling, but two, it's interesting to hear how Doug talks about how things are going on in the world a decade ago compared to now. It's almost as if he did this presentation today. So anyways, this is Doug Casey's presentation at Jayant Bhandari's Capitalism Morality Conference, presented originally on July 26th, 2014. So I guess almost 10 years ago, right? 9 years and 11 months ago. And looking forward to getting into it. So again, welcome to ANCAP Radio. Get ready for an awesome presentation. Team, take it away.
Our next speaker, Doug Casey, is brutally and fearlessly honest. These qualities left me in complete awe, and I started to fully appreciate the term intellectual honesty and realized the basic fundamental ingredient of a strong character is honesty in one's thoughts and one's action. Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is Doug Casey. He is the chairman of Casey Research. He has recently written 2 books, Totally Incorrect and Right in the Money. It's my great honor to invite Doug to the podium to share his thoughts about the decline of Roman Empire and similarities of what has been happening in the West. Doug.
Okay, it looks like this is Ancient Roman History Day after Larry's speech this morning. And I've got to apologize for basically having to read this because I started writing an article about Rome versus the U.S., and then I expanded it, and I think I might bring this up to a book length at some point. But anyway, let me try to compress all of Roman history and a lot of American history into a short period of time. So, what I want to do is I want to talk about what happened to Rome, and based upon what happened to Rome, what's likely to happen to the U.S. And of course, this is going to be a presentation about the things that you're not supposed to talk about in polite company, namely religion, politics, and bad-mouthing the military. And I'll give you a spoiler alert. There are a lot of similarities between the U.S. and Rome. There are reasons why people look to Rome as opposed to any other civilization when looking at the future of the U.S. Now, everybody knows that Rome declined, but few understand that the U.S. is well along that path. I'm going to give you a number of reasons that you may not have heard for that, too, assuming I have time to tell them to you. Rome probably reached the peak of its military and perhaps its economic power around the year 100. And I argue that's when it was at its absolute peak, or maybe even past its peak at the year 100. You can certainly argue that the U.S. was at its relative peak, certainly, and maybe at its absolute peak, as early as the 1950s. Because in 1950, the U.S. produced 50% of the world's output, 80% of its vehicles. Now we're down to 21% of the world's output, and only 5% of its vehicles, to take two indicators. Back in those days, the U.S. government had 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. Now it's only a quarter. It was by a large margin the world's largest creditor. Now it's by a large margin the world's biggest debtor. But it's not just the U.S. that's gone downhill. The U.S. started declining in the 1950s, which was its absolute peak. But Western civilization, which the U.S. is a part, started going downhill earlier. I'd say the peak for Western civilization was actually about 1910 or 1912. At that point, Europe controlled almost the entire world, politically, militarily, economically. But now, Europe is nothing but a Disneyland with real as opposed to papier-mâché buildings, and it's turning into a petting zoo for the Chinese. So it's even further down the slippery slope than the U.S. is. The U.S. has modeled itself after Rome. And if you model yourself after something, you tend to become like it. And like America, Rome was originally ruled by kings. Then it was self-governing with several different assemblies, not just one, and a senate. Later, the power devolved to an executive. We have Roman-styled architecture in Washington, D.C. The eagle is the national symbol of both countries. All of our mottos are Roman mottos in Latin. On the back of a dime, and you'll see the fasces, which is an axe surrounded by rods, which was a Roman symbol. And even when they wrote the Federalist Papers, the nom de plume of the authors was Publius, who was one of Rome's first consuls. And just like Rome, the U.S. is distinguished by its military prowess. So once again, when you pick a model, you tend to resemble it. Now, there's a considerable cottage industry that's developed over the years comparing ancient and modern times, especially since Edward Gibbon wrote his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in 1776, same year as Adam Smith wrote Wealth of Nations, same year as the Declaration of Independence was written, of course. I'm a fan of all three, but I've got to say that if you ever read Gibbon's Decline and Fall, 6 volumes, incidentally, I haven't read them all, it's actually a laugh riot. Gibbon has a very subtle and acerbic wit. But since the time that Gibbon wrote Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, there have been huge advances in the understanding of Rome, and they've been driven mainly by archaeological discoveries. There are a lot of things that Gibbon didn't know because he was basically a philologist, and he based his synthesis mainly on what the ancients said about themselves, Roman writings. That's where he got most of his information. There was no real science of archaeology in 1776 when he wrote the first volume, when the first volume was published. So there wasn't even much done with the inscriptions on monuments or what was on the coins, not to mention scientists digging around in old villas and battle sites and so forth. And actually Gibbon, like most historians, was actually a collector of hearsay. So what do we think we know about ancient Rome from the writers that were current? It's a lot like as if William Buckley and Gore Vidal and H.L. Mencken and Norman Mailer and George Carlin were all telling you their versions of the same event that happened only, 50 years ago. You wouldn't be sure what really the case was. So it's much, much more that way. If you go back 2,000 years, it's basically a study of he said, she said. So we can't be sure what the actual historical realities are. But I want to try to entertain you with a few guesses that I've made about this, because I've read a lot of ancient history. It's one of my hobbies. And I'll start by saying I'm not sure that the collapse of Rome wasn't a good thing. I think it probably was a good thing that it collapsed. And I want to talk about why I think it was an inevitable thing. There were many positive aspects to Rome, as there are to most civilizations, but there are other things about Rome that I very much disapprove of. For instance, it's anti-commercialism, it's militarism, and certainly post-Caesar, it's centralized and increasingly totalitarian government. So, why did Rome fall? In 1985, there were 210 reasons that were assembled by a German named de Mont. And some of them are silly. He just took all the reasons that have been put forward and listed them. And some are silly, like racial degeneration and homosexuality and excessive freedom. Some are redundant, just the different names for the same thing. And some of them seem to me to be common sense, such as financial bankruptcy, loss of moral fiber, and corruption. So it's pretty hard to summarize Gibbon's gigantic work briefly, but essentially Gibbon attributed the fall of Rome to two reasons, external and internal. And external were barbarian invasions, so everybody knows about that. And internal was Christianity. And I think he's actually pretty much right. But I want to cover a bunch of other reasons in addition to those two, and I want to amplify on those two that Gibbon pinpointed. You don't have to agree with my interpretation of these various things. I'm going to touch on the political, the legal, the social, the demographic, ecological, military, psychological, intellectual, and religious and economic reasons for its collapse. But a little bit of history. I'm going to skip over a lot of this stuff because we just got too much stuff and we might want to discuss this later. So let me get right into political reasons. It's misleading to talk about the fall of Rome, actually. You've all learned in school the fall of Rome was 476 AD when the child emperor Romulus Augustus, oddly named because he was named after one of the mythical founders of Rome, Romulus, and Augustus was the first emperor. He was the last emperor of Rome. But I'm not sure that Rome fell at any particular date. It's more a question of what the paleontologists would call punctuated disequilibrium, where things changed quickly and then stayed the same quickly, stayed the same over time. Republican Rome fell in 31 BC with the accession of Augustus, the adopted son of Caesar. And that started what they called the Principate. And it almost disintegrated in the 50 years of the mid-3rd century. I mean, Rome almost really collapsed in the 250s when, in a space of 50 years, there was almost an emperor a year. And nobody really knows how many there were because there were so many different generals that last a few days and so forth. Maybe the end of Rome came in 378 when the Goths destroyed a Roman army at Adrianople, and all the other barbarian tribes which were up there saw that this Roman army was totally destroyed and figured, well, we can do that too, and they started crossing the Rhine and the Danube. And, from 378, things just went into full collapse over the next 30 years. So maybe we should use the year 410 as the year for the collapse of Rome because it was the year that Alaric, who was a Goth, who was also a Roman general, incidentally, and also a Christian, conducted a sack of Rome, although it was a kind of gentle sack, actually. And you might say that the civilization didn't really collapse until the late 600s when Islam spread out and conquered the Mediterranean and took away all of the richest provinces of Rome and well, by then it was the Eastern Roman Empire that was all that was left. Or maybe the fall of Rome only happened in 453 when Constantinople fell to the Turks. But maybe Rome hasn't even collapsed then, because even today, the Pope is still there, and he wears red shoes like Julius Caesar wore, and he's called the Pontifex Maximus, which was one of Caesar's titles. So it's hard to say. But one certain thing you can say about Rome, looking in a distant mirror, as it were, is that there was an accelerating trend of absolutism and centralization and totalitarianism and bureaucracy with Rome. And I think we can say that America, and I don't call it America anymore, as you know, I call it the United States. It's evolved from being America, which was a very good idea, into just one of 200 some nation states in the world, not much different from any of them at this point. I think that America entered its Principate period, which was the accession of Augustus and the Emperor period. I'd say during World War II, and Americans forget that Harry Truman was the last president of the United States. I'm no fan of Harry Truman's, but he was the last president of the U.S. to actually go out on the streets without Secret Service guys and walk around the streets. That's totally impossible in these days. So pretenses fell off in Rome over the years, just as they have in the U.S. And by the time of Diocletian, many of you are going to recognize that name because after the time of troubles in the mid-200s, he was the soldier emperor that, tied it all back together again, and among other things, he put on draconian wage and price controls and basically started the feudal system. And so historians say this was the end of the Principate. We went from the Republic to the Principate, and post-Diocletian, now it's called the Dominate, from Dominus. You're supposed to call the emperor your lord. So that's the story with the political generation of Rome. And after the Dominate, the emperor was treated like an oriental potentate. I mean, previously, the emperor, any common Roman citizen, could approach theoretically and actually practically the emperor and talk to him. This was totally impossible once it entered the Dominate period. So there are other things, just like the Senate and the councils and the tribunes with their vetoes became meaningless anachronisms as Rome degraded. The same thing has happened to U.S. Institutions, because by the time of Claudius, the Praetorians, Claudius was appointed by the Praetorians. The Praetorian Guard were palace guard set up by Augustus. It showed that they could designate the emperor. And at this point, I think it's probably true of the American Praetorian Guard, which are the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, and about a dozen others. And of course, all these generals in the military with all their special forces of one type or another. These guys are seriously in charge, I think. So my guess also is that as the ongoing and deepening Greater Depression evolves and the dollar is destroyed in a serious war, not just a sport war like in Iraq or Afghanistan, I'm talking a serious war, gets underway, I think that the bourgeoisie are going to look for a strong president, and that's likely to be a military guy. because Americans think the military, which is really just a heavily armed version of the post office, and it's the only thing that still appears to work in the U.S. And Americans love their military. And of course, you all know that the greatest presidents are all war presidents, guys that started wars, Lincoln, Wilson, FDR, etc. And military heroes like Andrew Jackson and Ulysses Grant, Teddy Roosevelt, Eisenhower. It's easy to elect a general. So I think that's who the Republicans are going to put up the next time. That's just a guess. So as far as the military is concerned, incidentally, getting ahead of myself a little bit, I'd advise you to keep Gibbon's words in mind. He said, any class of men accustomed to violence and slavery make for very poor guardians of a civil constitution. And that's what the military are. They're a class of men accustomed to violence and slavery. So he's quite correct. Anyway, let's take a look at the legal part of Rome. Romans were supposedly ruled by laws, just as we're supposedly ruled by laws. But in the case of Rome, it started out with 12 tablets that were engraved. Everybody could see them. 451 BC was when this happened. Simple dictates. And this started changing definitively under Diocletian, where everything was done by decree, and no longer anybody could keep track of the laws and so forth. So this is pretty much the way it is today, where there are thousands of volumes full of laws and regulations. Nobody even knows what they are until it's convenient to bring them to people's attention. But this trend accelerated under Constantine, who was another famous Roman emperor, that died 325 AD, and also the first Christian emperor. And here I'd like to start drawing Christianity into the fall of Rome, because Christianity is a top-down religion. You got God on top, and priests and the bishops, and then the bishops and then the priests, and so forth. It's top-down, where these things are interpreted. So Roman religion, classical Roman religion, never tried to capture men's minds that way. It was a totally different thing, classical religion, and much superior to Christianity, I think, if you want a religion. But before Christianity, violating the emperor's laws was not seen as violating God's laws. After Christianity, you violated the emperor's laws, you were also breaking God's laws. I think the devolution is similar in the U.S., because you'll recall that there are only 3 crimes listed in the U.S. Constitution. They happen to be treason, counterfeiting, and piracy. And that's all there is as far as federal laws. But now if you've read Harvey Silverblate's book, you'll find that there are at least 5,000 federal crimes, and he figures that the average American commits 3 felonies a day. So once again, I'll throw you back to, in this case, Tacitus. And he said, the more numerous the laws, the more corrupt the nation. Because corruption is, in fact, to get around the laws. What's that? To hack around the laws. So I'm all for corruption, actually, but that's a different subject. Social. How about the social similarities between Rome and the U.S.? Now, along with all the political and social, political legal problems, there are social problems. Everybody knows about useless mouths in Rome and the bread and circuses and so forth. But this only started in the late Republic with the Punic Wars. And these things were mostly limited to the capital city itself, and a few other big cities, but it's mostly in the city of Rome itself. But bread and circuses kept the mob under control. And at its peak, the city of Rome had about 1 million inhabitants. The empire itself, I guess 60 to 100 million, more closer to 60 million probably. But in Rome, they had 1 million people, and it was a big mob, and at least 30% of them were on the dole. And the dole, now this is interesting, how long can these things last? The dole in Rome start to finish, was about 500 years. And it only was cut off when wheat shipments from Egypt and North Africa were cut off with the Vandals taking over North Africa. So 500 years. I mean, these things can last a long time. I don't think that the welfare programs we have are going to do as well. Another thing, kind of interesting, is the demographic comparison of Rome and the U.S. The empire appears to have suffered a demographic collapse late in the 2nd century, about the time of Marcus Aurelius, the famous emperor that you all saw in Gladiator, which incidentally was a reasonably historically accurate movie. As incidentally, that series on HBO called Rome was very compressed, obviously, but it was pretty good, I think. And written by John Milius, an excellent writer. Anyway, at that point, commerce started falling and the standard of living dropped radically with the constant warfare as well as the welfare. But the problem wasn't that people were just dying with plagues and constant warfare, but they actually weren't reproducing. And once again, I'll draw you back to Christianity, because Christianity thought the body was evil, the Virgin Mary was good, you should become a nun, you shouldn't become a monk, you shouldn't reproduce, sex was bad. And this is probably another reason why the demographic collapse occurred in ancient Rome. Just as you know, it's occurring now in the OECD countries because after World War II, American women averaged 3.7 children apiece. Now it's 1.8. It's immigration that makes the population grow, not reproduction. You need at least 2.1 for the population to just stay stable. And in parts of Europe, people are reproducing at 1.3 per woman. So it's a severe demographic collapse. The same thing happened in Rome, incidentally. And I'll go into why I think the reasons are quite similar. Now, it's partially due to an understanding of birth control, of course, but a growing reason, and I think it was similar in Rome, is that people just can't afford it. It's an expensive proposition having kids. Now, or in the declining days of Rome when it was an economic collapse. So, and the last part, of course, is that if it was Christianity that provided the moral underpinning for not reproducing in those days, today it is decreasing your carbon footprint, which I'll lead into. I think what I'm leading up to is this whole greenism movement is like the new Christianity. Christianity was a bedbug that was sucking away the vitality of Rome, just as greenism and things of that nature are today. I don't want to offend you Christians in the audience, but I'm calling it the way I see it. Okay? Now let's talk about the military for a moment. Wars made Rome. This is interesting. Rome started out as a republic of farmers, each with his own plot of land. It was totally a republic of farmers, very much like the U.S. started out. And as wars expanded the country's borders, it brought in wealth. But those wars sowed the seeds of destruction in Rome, just as they have in the U.S. And of course, the big ones were the wars against Carthage from 264 to 146 BC. That's when the Republic really turned the corner. In those days, you had to be a landowner to join the Roman army. Forget about the draft. Forget about hiring mercenaries. They wouldn't take you unless you were a landowner, not just a citizen. Yeah, no riffraff involved. It was a great honor. So the problem is that when the Romans fought these wars, you might be gone for 5 or 10 or more years. And meanwhile, your wife and kids back at the farm had trouble maintaining it. They might have to borrow money if the crop went bad. So what happened is that by the time the soldiers got back, especially from the Punic Wars, the farms were in disrepair, wife maybe thought he was dead, remarried. And of course, like soldiers anywhere, you go off to war, raping and killing for however many years, you pick up some bad habits that you might not have had before. So, in addition to that, in those days, war could be a very profitable enterprise. Why? You see a fat, rich country over there. Okay, if you've got a good military, and the Romans had the best military, you invade it, what happens? You steal all the gold and artwork and steal all the women and all the cattle and enslave all the men and children that you didn't kill. This is very profitable. Slaves had, huge value. And then, whatever's left, you could tax it, and more money would come in for at least a period of time. So warfare looked good to the Romans. I mean, really, you conquer and steal, and it all flows into the capital city, and that's where the boats are. So war was a good thing for them, actually. But on the other hand, the soldiers pick up bad habits, the yeoman farmers go away. Then you start importing grain from North Africa and Egypt because they're not growing it anymore in Italy. And this tidal wave of slaves that you brought in to work the freshly confiscated properties, they're a social problem. So I think, like America, Rome became much more urban and less agrarian over time. And it became a giant industrial latifundia. Now, let's see, Spain and North Africa, is that worth covering? Anyway, the wars helped destroy the essential Roman fabric that I think you could argue made Rome great. Got to pick up the pace here a little bit. Interesting stuff, I thought. But okay. Let's see. All right. Stream of wealth stopped flowing into Rome after Trajan conquered Dacia, today's Romania, in 1006. Or I should say 106. Now, nothing more to conquer. They've already looted everything through taxes. Now, they got a problem because there are barbarians on the borders that are becoming Romanized, and they're picking up better weapons and better techniques. They're becoming wealthier. They're seeing all this wealth there. So now, instead of being aggressive and reaching out to steal and plunder, which was good for them, now they've got these barbarian hordes that they've got to defend against. So instead of a yeoman army of citizen landholders, now you've got to pay professionals to defend the borders. And this is expensive, and taxes went way up, and that had all kinds of consequences I don't have to explain to you all. So, in any event, that's what happened to Rome's military. And I will say, but I think the same thing is happening to the U.S. military at this point. Everybody knows that the U.S. spends about as much militarily as, well, not quite the rest of the world put together, but the next 40 countries put together. So it's bankrupting the country. And I live in Argentina a good part of the year, most of the year actually. And are you aware of the fact that it was 3 years ago? Now everybody knows what a mess the Falklands War against the British was. But do you know that 3 years ago, the Argentines had a destroyer that was sitting at the dock, and it sank at the dock and heeled over 45 degrees? They just didn't have the money to maintain it. This is incredible. An actual naval destroyer sinks at the dock and heels over 45 degrees. So could this happen? It happened to the Soviet Navy. Happened to the Soviet Navy. Could it happen to the U.S. Navy? Yeah, I think it might, actually. The military doesn't defend the U.S. The military is in the process of destroying the U.S. And I think it's increasingly ineffective in the way warfare is going, because You know, a $1,000 Strela shoulder-launched missile will definitely take out a low-flying $50 million F-16. And a $150 IED will definitely take out a $5 million M1 tank. And an Arab teenager with an AK-47 will definitely take out a U.S. soldier, which costs about $1 million with the training, the equipment, the benefits. So it's a matter of economics. War is just a matter of economics. And the way the wars are going to be fought, kind of like open source warfare, where you're fighting 100 different groups. They may hate each other, but they hate you more, and they all watch each other and trade techniques. It'll bankrupt the U.S. And the U.S. is stupid enough to use World War II technology, basically, B-2 bombers and F-35 fighters, which is probably a piece of junk, to fight Arab teenagers. Forget about it. You're not going to win. So, anyway, it's the same as Rome, actually. Now, let me give you an interesting quote here. This is from a guy named Priscus, who is the Roman ambassador to the court of Attila, when Attila was already occupying parts of what are now Hungary and Germany, the Rome and Switzerland and so forth. Okay, so while Priscus is in the court of Attila, and he's from Constantinople, while he's there, he met a Greek who joined the barbarians. So Priscus met one of his countrymen who joined the barbarians, the Huns. And here's the story he tells to Priscus. He said, the Greek says to Priscus, after the war, the Scythians live in inactivity, enjoying what they have gained, harassed very little or not at all. The Romans, on the other hand, are very liable to perish in war, as they have to rest their hopes of safety on others, and are not allowed on account of tyrants to use arms. Incidentally, once the Dominate came, the average Roman, unless you were in the army or very upper class, you had no right to bear arms. The Romans were all disarmed. That's what he's talking about here. And they were useless for the army. They didn't know how to use them. So, he says, and those who use them are injured by the cowardice of their generals who cannot support the conduct of war. But the condition of subjects in time of peace is far more grievous than the evils of war, for the exaction of the taxes is very severe. And unprincipled men inflict injuries on others because the laws are practically not valid against all classes. So, this is testimony from about the year 450, when Rome was. Same thing, you could say these things today. Now, just to placate you druids in the audience, if there are any, actually environmental degradation may have had something to do with the collapse of Rome. Soil exhaustion, deforestation, pollution, abetted by plagues, which abetted plagues, I should say, were all problems for Rome. Analogy today? Well, I don't know. Rick and I have certainly talked about the dangers of these gigantic monocultures. You drive across the central plains of Canada and the U.S., it's just mile after mile after mile of the same plant. And this just seems to me like an accident waiting to happen. The right fungus or the right bug or the right something. And in addition to that fact, you can argue that although they pour a lot of chemical fertilizers on the plains, the micronutrients aren't there, and the little bugs and bacteria are all killed by pesticides. There's no worms in the soil, they're killed all by the pesticides and such. I don't know. Environmental degradation, the fact that like Ogallala Reservoir and other things are being drained to grow corn and such. I don't know, it's an argument. But incidentally, one of the reasons for the collapse of Rome was that it was one of those cyclical warm periods in between roughly 200 BC and 200 AD. Happened in the Han Dynasty of China, too, and it was coincident with their rise. Same thing in Rome. And oddly enough, the world got noticeably cyclically cooler, starting about the year 200, which is about when things started to collapse. Incidentally, I don't believe in global warming. I think the chances are better we're going to go into a new ice age than go into the super warming nonsense that they promote. I mean, that's a whole different thing. So, let's talk about economics for a moment. I gave you a quote from Priscus, who was one ambassador. This is Salvian, who was 10 years earlier than Priscus. This is about 440 AD. And Salvian says, "But what else can these wretched people wish for? They who suffer the incessant and continuous destruction of public tax levies." He's talking about his fellow Romans. He says, "To them, there is always imminent a heavy and relentless proscription. They desert their homes, lest they be tortured in their very homes. They seek exile, lest they suffer torture. The enemy is more lenient to them than the tax collectors. This is proved by the very fact that they flee to the enemy in order to avoid the full force of the heavy tax levy. Therefore, in the districts taken over by the barbarians, there is one desire among all the Romans, that they should never again find it necessary to pass under Roman jurisdiction. In those regions, it is the one and general prayer of the Roman people that they be allowed to carry on the life they lead with the barbarians." So that's from the horse's mouth, 440 AD. Now, you can't imagine somebody at the time of Cicero or Caesar or even Marcus Aurelius saying anything like that, because it wasn't true. So, I'd say that things are getting similar in the U.S. But incidentally, when Constantine instituted Christianity as the state religion, it got worse for the economy, and not because of a class of priests who are now supported by taxes. This was never the case, incidentally, with previous Roman regimes. Those, the state didn't pay for these things, private people paid for it. But once the church took over under Constantine, it was a state religion. It was supported by this class of useless mouths called practicing priestcraft, were supported by the state. And also, I've got to say, with its attitude of waiting for heaven and its belief that this world was just a horrible test, it encouraged the Romans to hold material things in low regard and essentially despise money and wealth. Negative. I'm building a case here why Gibbon was right, and Christianity was a parasite that actually just was not, it was one of the major causes of the collapse of Rome. So let's go into this a little bit further. And, yeah, sure. You were saying well, once Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire in 323 AD, and especially as the decades went on, it became more powerful. It became, and other religions were legalized in 378 under Valentinian. I mean, all these priests and churches, they were all financed by the state. Taxes, along with the legions and everything else. It made no sense to be a Roman anymore. Right. Yeah. Oh, I'm well aware of the distinction that you're making. Right. Okay. So, all right. What I'm trying to say is that this may interest you. It's that over time, Christianity has mutated, and it was a very, very different thing, Christianity, in the early days of Rome, up until Constantine, and even a little after that, when it was complicit in the fall. In other words, Christianity changed. It used to be the peace and Jesus and pacifism and turn the other cheek and all this type of thing when it was growing. Well, once it became the state religion, it was onward Christian soldiers, and it mutated and changed its character. So let me go into this a little bit more. Now, Christianity today is still the dominant religion in American culture, but unlike in late antiquity, when it was very pacifistic, Christianity is actually now very warlike. And it has been for a long time. We got the Crusades and the religious wars, onward Christian soldiers. I bet the Muslims love to hear that song. And conservatives all believe in God and guns. They think that's what America is based on. So it's actually a paradox that the U.S. military today is a hotbed of Christianity, because today's religion is very money and material prosperity oriented. You've got the rich and corrupt Catholic Church. I speak as an ex-member of this cannibalistic death cult, incidentally. It's like only Jews can say bad things against Jews, and only blacks can say nigger. Well, okay, I'm an ex-Catholic, so I can say these things for those of you who are politically correct. So it's a paradox that the U.S. military is a hotbed of Christianity, and it is, incidentally, because fundamentalist preachers, Calvinists, Mormons, all of them are very money-grubbing in principle, and that's a 180-degree change from the founding principles of the church in those early centuries when it helped to destroy Rome. Christianity has become a very conservative force that's antithetical. I'm talking about Christianity as a whole, to its founding principles. And I would suggest that Christianity today occupies the place of classical religion in late Rome. Now, this is kind of interesting, I think. And I'll tell you why before I run out of time. I'm not even going to get into the second law of thermodynamics, which I think is really what's going to bring this stuff all down. Okay, what are you going to do? In any event, in the days of classical Rome, everybody believed in gods and sacrificed to them, but towards the end it was just paying lip service to the gods. And that's true of Christianity today in the US, and especially in Europe, I think. Traditional Christianity is being replaced by new secular religions. It used to be Marxism, which is a secular religion, that's fading. Democracy is another secular religion, that's ascendant. But actually, greenism and environmentalism are the real hot tickets to replace Christianity for religions. And for those who want a more conventional God, you can go to Islam, which is by far the world's fastest growing religion. And the process is much further along in Europe than it is in the US. So I think that it's important, if a civilization is going to survive, it should really have some common core beliefs. And just as the Romans lost their spiritual rudder with the ascendancy of Christianity, the Europeans already have, and the Americans aren't far behind. So I don't want to go into all these things about Apollonius of Tyana and how Jesus was the Chris Angel of his day and all this type of thing. Forget about that. I don't have any time anymore here. But, anyway, what I'd like to do, because I do have time for this, I think, is debunk some of the Christian virtues and show you how these things, when they insinuated themselves into Roman society, actually helped to destroy the good things about Rome. The cardinal virtues of Christianity, everybody know what they are? No good Christians here? Few, one. Okay, faith, hope, and charity. You've all heard of that, okay? And people consider these things virtues. They're vices. Faith is believing in the unknown and the unbelievable. It's not a virtue. Hope is counting on magic to kiss everything and make it better. And, neither of these are formulas for success in the material world. And charity, which is the most cardinal virtue, according to St. Paul, one of the most bent psychotics in world history, from my point of view, actually. And it almost always promotes the dissipation of capital, time, energy, emotion, dissipates it to aid those who have generally done zero to deserve anything. So a rich civilization like ours can last for a while with these flaws. People just pay lip service to them today. But in the early days of the church, people took that stuff seriously. And the Romans didn't have the kind of accumulated capital. They couldn't afford these things. And let me go further. The Christian virtues are destructive, but their 7 deadly sins are totally ass backward also. Let's take a look at the 7 deadly sins that are promoted by Holy Mother of the Church, or Christianity in those days. They were synonymous, notwithstanding all the heresies like Arianism and God knows how many there were. Anger, okay? That's one of the 7 deadly sins. Now, I'd say anger is certainly a fault, but it can often be righteous and justifiable. Greed. I agree with Gordon Gekko. Greed can actually be good when it represents the drive to be productive. It's enthusiasm for being productive, actually. And pride, unless we're talking about arrogance or hubris, which are different things, it's properly just self-esteem, and it's a virtue. Gluttony, sloth, and lust are really no more than character flaws and bad habits. I don't approve of these things particularly, but they're not cardinal sins. And of the so-called 7 deadly sins, only envy, actually, I consider to be an actual vice. But we go further about how Christianity insinuated itself and destroyed the Roman culture that built it, the good things of it. How about the Beatitudes? Everybody's supposed to love the Beatitudes. Jesus on a mount, Well, let's debunk those. Blessed are the poor in spirit. What? It's actually ignoble. It's ignoble to bless those that don't have self-respect and the ability to accomplish things that can actually make you rich in spirit. And how about this? Blessed are they who mourn. And the Romans who heard this had to conclude that Christianity was a sad sack, whiny religion. And it was. Initially, the only ones that practiced Christianity were the slaves and the poor and the women because they were downtrodden. No, it was. So, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the land. And this is an overt untruth. It's a lie. The meek are generally those without backbone. They generally don't get the land. They get what they deserve. I'm of the opinion that almost everybody gets what they deserve. I like the concept of justice. But wait, there's more. There are more vices disguised as virtues by Christianity. How about the vows that most Christian priests take? Poverty, chastity, and obedience. Poverty. It's despicable. It makes, what does it do? It makes you a liability to others. And to the Romans, it made you one step up from a slave. Chastity. Ridiculous. It takes away one of the great pleasures of life, and the failure of Christians to reproduce in order to practice it was a major cause of population collapse. And obedience, some of this slave characteristic. No wonder the Romans despised Christians. They didn't even consider them worth talking about. It's a slave characteristic. Free men don't see obedience as a virtue. So, anyway, the pagans incidentally separated religion from ethics. Religion to the ancients was a way of giving cult, which is the origin of our word culture, to the gods. And the gods were, in effect, personifications of nature and of noble concepts. The determination of what was right and wrong and just and unjust and good and evil, that was left to philosophers, not to religious people that were reading dogma out of some book that you had to take as the word of God. So, of course, Christianity aberrated What were pagan virtues, you're wondering? Well, what did the Romans, pre-Christianity, hold in high regard? There were things like honor, courage, hospitality, generosity, fortitude, foresight, strength, perseverance, forbearance, honesty, wisdom, and justice. Little overlap, very little, between those virtues and the Christian virtues. Now you can see how you could have a strong and noble culture under pre-Christian conditions and how that would fall apart afterwards. Incidentally, I'm not opposed to religion per se, just for your information, insofar as it's an inquiry into the possible spiritual nature of man. So I don't see religion, if you define it that way, as being a bad thing at all. It's just that I think some regions are not. And these moral things are very important when we're talking about the collapse of an empire, because it was Napoleon who said correctly, in warfare, the spiritual, psychological is to the material as 3 is to 1. So it's very important. Now, we have new religions here that are equivalent to Christianity in early Roman times, before it became the state religion, when it flip-flopped. And it's doing the same thing to American culture. So I don't consider today's Christianity, it's perverse, but it's not the tapeworm that it was in Roman times. So the ancient Romans wanted everybody to worship its own gods and so forth. Won't go into that, no time. So let me see what I really wanted to say about this. Okay, well, classical religion implied man had to save himself. Okay, that's what philosophy was all about. And it encouraged personal responsibility, because you were responsible for yourself. But Christianity tells you to rely on Jesus, and that encourages irresponsibility. Somebody is going to save me, okay? But greenism and democracy tell you to sacrifice yourself to the planet and the collective. And the original Christian message has been de-emphasized and replaced with Christian righteousness and triumphalism in recent centuries. But now greenism is replacing Christianity as a source of guilt and a reason for self-abasement. Am I not right? I mean, you're an evil person if you drive your car or you ride a bicycle or do all these things. You know the drill. So Christianity used to hold that anything that seems at odds with revealed truth is anathema, like Islam does today. Islam is at about the same stage of development as Christianity was in the 13th and 14th centuries. So, yeah, just a stage they're going through, I hope. But anyway, in almost every area underpinning Christianity and its attitudes were termites eating away at ancient civilization. So let me see what I really want to say here. I didn't number my pages. Isn't that foolish? When you have all this paper and you don't number them, now you're in real trouble. Yeah, and I've already skipped over some good stuff, but you're not. The reason you're here isn't to listen to a lecture on ancient Rome. But let me say this: what's really going to bring down the United States? You're wondering. All this stuff is the similarities with Rome and Christianity, greenism, all this type of thing. That's all important, but the biggest thing that I'll draw to your attention, and one thing that Gibbon didn't consider, because nobody really understood it, and never existed, is the second law of thermodynamics. I don't know how many of you guys have considered that, but it's one of the few laws I believe in. That's right. And basically, the second law holds that entropy conquers everything, and that over time, all systems wind down and degrade. And the more complex systems become, the more energy it takes to maintain them. And the more complex and interconnected and interdependent they become, the more prone they are to break down and catastrophic failure. And that includes countries and civilizations. And the Romans reached their physical limits within the confines of their scientific, engineering, economic, and other types of knowledge. And the moral values of the civilization and their founding philosophies were washed away by a new religion. Now, we may reach our technological limits, and our founding fathers are certainly being washed away. Now, it's true that our scientific and technical knowledge is still compounding rapidly here in the West. And the reason for that is that there are more scientists and engineers alive today than have lived in all of human history previously. So, that's good. Things are going to continue advancing. But maybe only advancing like the momentum on a flywheel that winds down. Because in order to do giant science and engineering projects, you need capital. And I'm afraid capital itself is being destroyed. That's what all the debt we have is about. When you have savings, it means that you've been producing more than you consume. Savings are a sign of that. When everybody is in debt, like the government and like the average American, it means you've been consuming more than you produce. Well, how is that possible? Well, there's two ways it's possible. One is you borrow the capital that other people have saved over many years past and take on debt for that. Or the other thing is you mortgage your future. That's how you do it. So I think that's actually happening at this point. And I think if there's not enough capital, scientific and engineering productivity is going to slow down. That's why they don't have any science and engineering in Zimbabwe. There's no capital in Zimbabwe to finance. The same thing could happen here. So, my solution to America's decline and fall, you all know what that is. You're all libertarians, so we don't need to preach to the choir anymore. What else am I going to say? Well, I guess I'd say that Rome was corrupt and it deserved to collapse. And certainly, towards the end, all these things, food, and fuel, and rare goods and spices, all came into Rome. And what went out of Rome? Nothing but trucks full of garbage and things they'd throw in the Tiber, more garbage and dead bodies and laws. And that's why it collapsed, because as it got bigger and bigger and rose to 1 million people, the second law took over. I mean, got to keep bringing more energy in, and at some point it's not possible. So I'm not going to go on about that. But anyway, even when Rome collapsed, incidentally, whether you want to pick the time of collapse as the mid-200s or the late 300s or the early 400s or the late, even after things really did collapse in the 500s and 600s, it appears from writings that we have that there were people on the fringes of the empire in places like Lusitania, which is Portugal, way down on the fringe, or Mauritania on the fringe of the Sahara, where people were living just as good as they did during the first century. There were villas in the country and all of that. So, on the other hand, if you were in the capital itself when the barbarians were looting and pillaging, it wasn't so pleasant. But I don't know what's going to happen in the next decade. I'm kind of putting my money on ugly collapse, quite frankly. But I don't know. And in the long run, it doesn't make any difference, because as a solipsist, I think this is all a figment of our imagination anyway. So just enjoy the show. I mean, all these facts about Rome, for all I know, they were made up by George Carlin equivalent and the writings that we have. So I think we're almost over. We've probably got 5 minutes of time for any questions or something like that. Oh, good. So who's got some thoughts on the coming collapse of Western civilization and the past collapse of Roman civilization? Anybody?
I heard one of your podcast on YouTube where you say it's hopeless America as we knew those statistics. It's the conclusion is gone.
Yeah, that's true. Everything changes. I mean, look, America has been actually, like I said, it's been going downhill relatively and absolutely since the mid to late 1950s. But the trend started, well, it's like I gave you 1,000 years worth of possible dates for the collapse of Rome. You can do the same for America. Maybe the collapse started in earnest with the Spanish-American War and then World War I and all that, but maybe it started with Lincoln. Maybe it actually started just after the country was founded with the Alien and Sedition Acts. I mean, they happened like 5 years or something like that after the Constitution was formed, and already this was like the Patriot Act of its day. So, the second law is grinding away at everything, unless you constantly put more energy. Things get more decrepit and they move. It's like a human body. It's the same thing. It's disgusting. Yeah, but the rest of that saying, but it's not serious.
So what is your solution?
Well, I said I didn't go into my solution. We're all libertarians. You know what the answer is. I mean, it's a moral it's moral righteousness and economic sanity and essentially anarchism and all that. But that's not going to happen. You can forget about that. And if you talk about that too seriously, once the next serious war starts, once again, not a sport war, but a serious war, you better not. That's why H.L. Mencken dummied up during both World War I and World War II. He didn't want to be lynched by these other chimpanzees. And they were much less like chimpanzees in his era than they are in ours, in my opinion. So, no, you can't do anything about it. I mean, I'm an idiot saying the things that I do in public. I may do a little bit of good. It's like Jesus said. It's appropriate tonight. I can do a quote from Jesus, who has some very credible quotes. Let those who have ears hear. And I do it because I believe in good karma, quite frankly. But is it intelligent? No, not very. No fans are wrong here. I'm surprised. Oh, Jeff.
Well, because I'm very interested in your comments on early Christianity. I'm looking at my own readings of the church fathers. Sometimes it seems like a different religion from what you get in like the second millennium after the contact with Judaism and Islam in Spain, and of course the St. Thomas of Aquinas and the emergence of Scholastic. Like a whole different aesthetic, and a different sort of world structure, and different outlook towards commerce. Everything's very different. I'm wondering what Christian comments would be on that, and more generally, just the adaptability of Christianity through the ages of different cultures and different times and places, and what that says about its theological structure.
Well, to start out with, to me, Jesus was just one of many social and political and religious radicals wandering around Palestine at that time. He had the good fortune to be crucified, but he had the super good fortune to have St. Paul, Paul of Tarsus, kind of take a liking to what he said. And there are actually two religions. One is the one, if you read what Jesus actually said, a lot of it's, I think, very acceptable and intelligent. And then you read what Paul says in the epistles, and they're totally different religions. I mean, he was the first one who really got on message with something else. And then, because he was puritanical, and he was anti-woman, he was doctrinaire, horrible person, I mean, I think, from just about every point of view. And then all the early fathers of the church, especially starting in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, these guys were ultra-double doctrinaire, puritanical, horrible people. And, then it mutated again with St. Thomas Aquinas. And so, Karl Marx was quite correct. I mean, the church adopts itself like a chameleon. If it can't mold society, then it's molded by society. It's true everywhere in the world. It's on its way out. Christianity is on its way out.
Mary became a virgin in 1200.
Yeah, people, they argue, they've been arguing about this stuff. And was Jesus God or man, or was he both? And there have been just hundreds of thousands of people that have gotten...
Virginity became part of the whole thing in the ecumenic council of 1200.
Yeah, because priests could get married before then, too. So, maybe that was a secondary surge of Puritanism. I don't know. It's a good question. Good answer. Yes, sir.
I have another religious question. Where is this realism going to? What's the natural end to this now? Where's it heading?
Well, I don't know. Look, on the one hand, I'm optimistic. On the other hand, I believe in Einstein. And I think his most famous observation was, after hydrogen, stupidity is the most common thing in the universe. So who can tell where it's going to end? It could go on and on. Greenism, where is it going to end? It's all around you here. Even out here in this lobby, I'm looking at, there's 4 different places that you have to choose where to put your trash. And if I was the trash man, I'd just throw them all together after the idiots feel good about here or here or here. I just throw it all in my dump truck, which is probably what happens. It's all a giant sham.
But do you think it's detrimental to the economy? And I think it is in a way, but
yeah, it is. What is good for the economy is people is a free market creating more wealth. And all this greenism actually destroys wealth from stopping things from happening and consuming capital by making it slower and harder to do things and do anything. Build a factory, hire a person, find a mineral deposit. You can't do anything without bureaucrats. And of course, the nature of bureaucracy is not to do anything, because you can get in trouble doing stuff, and there's no upside, no profit by doing stuff. So the world's becoming more bureaucratized and much more financialized. I mean, that was a comment Rick made that was quite correct. I mean, brokers serve a purpose, but when 1 out of 3 people in the world are brokers, I'm not sure they serve that much of a purpose anymore.
Are you familiar with Joseph Taylor's work on the class complex?
I haven't read that book. I got to read that book.
Well, yeah, because what you're talking about almost parallels the discussion, and the point that where he focuses on, which he didn't bring up, was the energy collapse, the rising price of energy. So whereas Rome had basically a source of cheap solar energy by looting the countries it was conquering. And then with America, you pretty much got a fossil fuel-based economy, and the price of fuel in terms of barrels of oil per barrel more than per barrel out is constantly increasing. And I don't really see enough libertarians that keep talking about how is this complex society going to survive this rising price of energy. And I really think a libertarian society is a low energy society. It's a decentralized society. And the only example Taylor gives of an example of a society that collapsed and survived was the Byzantine Empire, about 600, where they basically broke up the army and said, okay, this is your hill, your town, you farm will be defended, see you later, we'll move there.
Yeah, well, as far as energy is concerned, it should be a complete non-problem. And therefore, unless the political and social things get much worse, energy shouldn't be. There's infinite energy from the sun. They should have, decades ago, put up gigantic multi-square mile solar collectors to microwave energy down to the earth. They could have done that. I mean, if it hadn't been for the Greens, we wouldn't be on second generation or third generation nuclear power plants. We'd already have little nuclear power plants the size of a few of these tables that would be producing megawatts enough to power a city with no maintenance for, a decade or two. I mean, the things that we could have had if it hadn't been for politics, I mean, it should be no problem. You bring in all that extra energy, you can do lots more things. I mean, we should already be colonizing the planets. I mean, we shouldn't be rooting around for copper and nickel and other essential elements in low-grade deposits. We should be mining the asteroids for them, cheaply, with infinite solar power and no gravity and some, I mean, it's all politics and stupidity as far as I'm concerned. I mean, ultimately, maybe Ray Kurzweil is right. And within 20 years, that's what he estimates, and he's been pretty right so far on his timeline of what's going to happen, maybe we'll have a singularity. So if you can live another 20 years, maybe you'll get to live forever in some form anyway, identifiable as you, maybe. So, there's lots of cause for optimism. But barring Deus ex machina devices such as I've been bringing up, yeah, the U.S. is going to collapse, the same as Rome did, the same as the Athenian Empire did before it. And this is the way the world works. Death is part of life. Okay, thanks, guys.
That's all for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. See you next week. Peace.